I think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it.
For a monarchy built on silence, the most alarming moments are often the ones wrapped in perfect calm. And now, reports surrounding Prince William, the Prince of Wales, Queen Camilla, and a so-called Regency Clause 4 have raised one unsettling question. Was this simply palace procedure, or the first visible sign of a deeper royal rupture? According to recent royal commentary and online discussion, claims have emerged suggesting that William may have invoked an obscure internal mechanism to suspend Camilla's royal duties, at least temporarily, after concerns were reportedly raised about palace communication, influence, and the handling of sensitive royal matters. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that Queen Camilla has been removed from all royal duties, nor has it confirmed any such dramatic constitutional action. But the power of the story lies in what it suggests, because even an unconfirmed report can reveal the pressure points people already believe exist inside the modern monarchy. The phrase Regency Clause 4 sounds almost like something pulled from an old leather-bound file hidden in a royal archive, and that is exactly why it has captured attention. It evokes emergency, secrecy, and the idea that the crown still carries ancient safeguards for moments when personal loyalty and institutional survival collide. Whether the phrase is being used literally, symbolically, or through speculation, it points toward one of the most sensitive questions surrounding King Charles III's reign. Who protects the monarchy when the palace itself appears divided by competing interests? That question matters because this is not only about Camilla. It is about the fragile balance between the current reign and the future one. King Charles remains the monarch, and his authority has not been publicly transferred. Yet the public conversation around the royal family has increasingly focused on William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, and the long-term shape of the crown. Every mention of regency, succession, suspension, or emergency procedure feeds into a much larger fear that the monarchy may be preparing for internal change faster than the public has been told. For William, the story carries enormous symbolic weight. The Prince of Wales is not merely a son inside a complicated family. He is the future king, the person expected one day to protect the institution from instability, scandal, and uncertainty. If reports are accurate that he took any formal or informal step to challenge the influence around Camilla's office, then royal watchers would see it as more than a family disagreement. They would see it as a future monarch learning that duty sometimes demands action long before the crown is placed on his head. But was this truly an act of protection, or would it risk looking like a son moving against his father's wife? That is where the emotional tension becomes more difficult. Camilla's position beside Charles has always carried history. Her path to public acceptance was long, complicated, and often painful for the country to watch. To some, she represents loyalty to the king after decades of personal storms. To others, she remains a figure surrounded by unresolved feeling, especially when the memory of Diana, Princess of Wales, still shapes public emotion around William and Catherine. That is why any suggestion of Camilla being removed from duties, even temporarily, immediately becomes explosive. It touches not only the mechanics of the palace diary, but the emotional history of the House of Windsor. It raises questions about trust, access, influence, and whether the king's closest circle is fully aligned with the future direction of the monarchy. And because the palace has not publicly confirmed the dramatic claims, the silence only leaves more room for interpretation. Catherine's name also sits quietly behind this unfolding story, even when she is not at the center of the headline. If Camilla's duties were reduced, paused, or reassigned, observers would naturally ask who steps into the space left behind. In recent years, Catherine has increasingly been viewed as the steady emotional face of the next reign, someone associated with restraint, family, dignity, and continuity. So any report suggesting a shift away from Camilla inevitably makes royal watchers look toward the Princess of Wales and ask whether the future queen is already becoming more central to the monarchy's public image. This is where the first layer of conflict begins to emerge. It is not necessarily a confirmed battle between Camilla and Catherine, nor should it be presented that way. It is a symbolic contrast between the present queen and the future queen, between the reign of Charles and the reign that will one day belong to William. One represents the king's personal story and the completion of a long journey. The other represents the next chapter, the younger family line, and the public's hope for renewed stability. And if William is seen as invoking any kind of royal safeguard, even through speculation, the act carries a message that feels larger than procedure. It suggests a future king who is willing to separate family feeling from institutional responsibility. That may reassure some viewers, especially those who want the monarchy protected from internal confusion. But it may trouble others, because royal families are not machines. Behind every constitutional phrase are relationships, wounds, loyalties, and memories that cannot be neatly filed away. This is why the story feels so unsettling. The British royal family has survived because it understands how to make change look orderly. But stories like this suggest that beneath the polished surface, order may require difficult decisions that the public never fully sees. A royal duty disappearing from a diary, a name shifting from one schedule to another, a silence after a wave of speculation. These may seem small on their own, but in monarchy, small signs can carry enormous meaning. For now, the truth remains carefully guarded. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed a dramatic removal, and no responsible observer should treat unverified claims as fact. Yet the emotional reaction to the story shows that the public is already thinking about the monarchy in a new way. People are asking who holds influence, who controls access, who represents stability, and whether William is already being tested by the kind of decisions that will define him as king. And that is why this moment cannot be dismissed as ordinary royal noise. Whether Regency Clause 4 is a literal mechanism, a reported palace phrase, or a symbolic way of describing a power shift, it has opened a door to a deeper question. Was this about one royal duty being removed, or was it about the future king quietly drawing a boundary around the crown itself? Because what happened next was not simply about Camilla's place in the royal diary. It was about the hidden architecture of power inside the monarchy, and to understand why this mattered, we have to look at what may have been quietly building long before the public noticed. And what had been quietly building, if royal observers are reading the signs correctly, was not simply a disagreement over one royal diary or one office procedure. It was a deeper anxiety over access, influence, and control around the king himself. In any monarchy, the person who controls the flow of information does not merely organize paperwork. They can shape what is seen, what is delayed, what is prioritized, and what quietly disappears before it becomes a decision. That is why the alleged details surrounding this story feel so serious. Reports suggest the concern was not only that Camilla's duties may have been paused, but that the machinery around her had become too influential at a moment when the crown needed absolute clarity. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed those claims, and nothing should be treated as proven. But the idea alone touches a fear that has followed royal households for centuries. What happens when the sovereign becomes surrounded by competing voices, each trying to guide the direction of the reign? For William, that question is not theoretical. As the heir, he has a responsibility not only to support his father, but to protect the future structure of the monarchy he will one day inherit. That does not mean he has the freedom to act recklessly. In fact, the opposite is true. Any move involving Camilla would have to be handled with extraordinary caution, because a public rupture between the king's wife and the future king would immediately become a crisis of family, optics, and constitutional symbolism. This is where the phrase Regency Clause 4 becomes so powerful in the public imagination. It suggests that the matter, if true, was not handled as a personal quarrel, but as an institutional safeguard. A regency-related mechanism, even one discussed in speculative terms, implies emergency discipline rather than ordinary disagreement. It turns the question away from emotion and toward governance. Was this about personal loyalty, or was the monarchy quietly protecting its future? That distinction matters because royal duty often requires decisions that look cold from the outside. The crown is built on family, but it cannot operate like an ordinary family. It must survive illness, grief, scandal, generational change, and public judgment while still appearing calm. If William believed, according to reports, that any influence around Camilla was affecting the proper operation of royal duties or communication, then the issue would no longer be about hurt feelings. It would become about institutional trust. And yet, the emotional cost would be enormous. Charles's relationship with Camilla is not a minor part of his life. It is woven into the history of his personal identity, his public redemption, and the emotional architecture of his reign. Any move that appears to reduce a role, even temporarily, could be felt by the king as more than a diary adjustment. It could feel like a wound delivered through palace procedure. That is what makes William's alleged position so difficult to interpret. Some royal watchers may see him as a decisive future monarch, willing to draw a boundary when the crown's integrity appears at risk. Others may see a far more painful possibility, a son stepping into authority at the very moment his father may need loyalty most. Neither reading is simple, and that is why this story has become more than another royal rumor. It forces viewers to ask whether duty and family can truly remain separate inside the House of Windsor. Camilla, too, is affected in a way that goes beyond the official calendar. If her duties were truly suspended or reduced, the public meaning would be unmistakable. Royal duties are not simply events. They are signals of trust. To appear on behalf of the crown is to be seen as part of its active face. To disappear from that visible rhythm, even for a limited period, can create the impression that one's influence has narrowed. But in the same movement, another figure naturally becomes more visible. Catherine's role would be watched closely because the Princess of Wales already carries the symbolism of the next reign. If duties once associated with Camilla were quietly reassigned, observers would ask whether this represented practical coverage or a deeper shift in the royal center of gravity. And that is where the story begins to widen. It is not only about who steps back, it is about who steps forward. For the palace, that is both an opportunity and a risk. Placing Catherine in more visible roles can reassure the public that the future is steady, composed, and familiar. But it can also sharpen comparisons between the present queen and the future queen, between the king's reign and William's eventual reign, between a chapter shaped by Charles's personal history and a chapter shaped by the Wales family's public image. According to some commentators, this is why the wider royal household may be watching the situation with unusual care. Princess Anne's name often enters these conversations because she represents duty without theatricality, a kind of hard institutional memory inherited from the late Queen's example. If figures like and appear to support a firmer line around royal operations, the public may read that as a sign that the issue is larger than family discomfort. Still, there is a danger in reading too much into silence. The palace often allows speculation to burn itself out rather than feeding it with denial. But silence can also deepen suspicion, especially when the public already believes the monarchy is entering a sensitive period. A missing engagement, a changed schedule, or a carefully worded announcement can become part of a much larger story before officials have said anything at all. That is the hidden implication of this reported Regency clause moment. It suggests that the monarchy's next great challenge may not be a public scandal, but a private adjustment of power behind polished doors. It may be about who has access to the king, who guides the message, who protects the future, and who is trusted to represent stability when the institution feels pressure from every side. And once that possibility enters the conversation, the story becomes far more serious. Because the deeper question is not simply whether Camilla was affected, or whether William acted, or whether Catherine benefited from a shift in duties. The deeper question is who truly controls the direction of the crown when one reign begins to feel fragile and the next begins to move closer. To understand why this mattered so much, we have to look at the quiet power struggle taking shape behind the scenes. To understand why this quiet power struggle matters so much, we have to look at the one force that has always shaped royal history more than any public statement: access. Inside a monarchy, power does not always belong only to the person with the title. It often belongs to the person closest to the decision, closest to the documents, closest to the private room, where the sovereign hears the last argument before the final choice is made. That is why the reports surrounding Camilla's office have become so sensitive. The issue, according to royal commentators, is not simply whether one diary was changed or one duty was removed. The deeper concern is whether the king's environment had become too carefully managed at a time when the monarchy needed absolute transparency. If information is delayed, softened, filtered, or redirected, even without dramatic intent, the entire balance of the royal household can begin to tilt. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed that such manipulation occurred, and the claims remain unverified. But the fear behind them is historically familiar. Royal courts have always been shaped by those who stand nearest to the throne: advisors, private secretaries, spouses, family members, and trusted aides can influence what a monarch sees and hears. And when a sovereign is under pressure, those closest voices can become more powerful than the public realizes. For William, that possibility would strike at the heart of his future duty. The Prince of Wales is not yet king, but he is already responsible for protecting the line that follows. His role is not only to wait, it is to watch, to learn, and at times to guard the institution from risks that may not yet be visible to everyone else. That is why the reported invocation of an old Regency-related safeguard, whether literal or symbolic, has captured such attention. It suggests a future monarch being forced to think like a sovereign before the crown is officially his. But the contradiction is painful. To act too early can look like ambition. To wait too long can look like weakness. If William challenges influence around Charles, some may see a son protecting his father. Others may see a future king tightening control around the next reign. In royal life, motives are rarely judged simply by what is done. They are judged by timing, appearance, and the emotional history surrounding the people involved. That emotional history cannot be separated from Camilla. Her position has always carried a complicated public meaning, and any suggestion that her role has been restricted immediately reawakens older feelings among royal watchers. For some, she is the woman who endured decades of criticism and finally stood beside Charles as queen. For others, she remains tied to wounds that the public never completely forgot. That tension makes every story involving her more explosive, because people are not only reacting to the present, they are reacting to memory. And yet, the monarchy cannot function by memory alone. It must think forward. It must ask who can represent stability now, who can represent continuity tomorrow, and who can be trusted to carry the public through periods of uncertainty. That is where Catherine's quiet importance grows stronger. If Camilla is associated with the king's personal past, Catherine is increasingly associated with William's institutional future. One belongs to a story of endurance. The other belongs to a story of preparation. Some observers believe this is the hidden dynamic behind the reported shift in duties. If Camilla's official role were ever reduced, even temporarily, the vacancy would not simply be administrative. It would create a symbolic opening. And in the eyes of many viewers, Catherine would naturally appear as the figure most capable of stepping into moments requiring warmth, dignity, and reassurance. That does not mean she is replacing Camilla in a formal sense. But symbolism does not always wait for formal language. This is where the consequences begin to widen. A change in visibility can reshape public perception faster than any palace explanation. If Catherine appears more often at central royal moments, the public may read it as preparation. If William takes a firmer role in protecting royal processes, commentators may read it as a sign of future kingship becoming active. If and is seen as supporting discipline inside the family, traditional viewers may read it as the older order quietly backing the next one. The Princess Royal's position matters here because it represents something the monarchy often needs during moments of tension: credibility without performance. She is not usually seen as someone who follows fashionable sentiment. Her reputation is built on duty, directness, and loyalty to the crown as an institution rather than to personal drama. If she were associated with any effort to steady royal operations, many would interpret that as a sign that the matter had moved beyond private discomfort. Still, the palace must be careful. A monarchy cannot appear to be cleansing itself in public without creating fear that something was wrong behind closed doors. It cannot allow speculation to harden into assumed fact. It cannot elevate William and Catherine too aggressively without making Charles appear diminished. And it cannot protect Camilla so completely that questions about influence seem ignored. Every path carries risk. That is what makes the reported Regency Clause 4 idea so potent. Whether the phrase reflects a real mechanism, an interpretation, or a dramatic label used by commentators, it represents a larger anxiety: the possibility that the monarchy may need internal safeguards not only against outside scandal, but against confusion within its own walls. That is a serious idea, because it suggests the crown's greatest threat may not always come from hostile newspapers, public protests, or distant critics. Sometimes it may come from imbalance within the very household meant to protect it. For Charles, this would be the most difficult part. The king must remain above faction. He cannot be seen as pulled between wife and son, present and future, affection and duty. Yet the public often reads him through precisely those tensions. If William acts, people ask what Charles allowed. If Camilla is questioned, people ask what the king knew. If Catherine rises, people ask whether the current reign is quietly giving way to the next. That is the impossible burden of a monarch in a transitional age. And for William, the burden becomes colder still. If he is seen as too forceful, he risks being accused of severity. If he is too restrained, he risks appearing unprepared. A future king must learn that duty is not always popular in the moment. Sometimes it requires decisions that only make sense when viewed through the long lens of history. But was this one of those moments, or was it a sign that palace pressure had already gone further than anyone outside could understand? That is the question section 3 leaves hanging. The pieces are beginning to connect. Access to the king, the visibility of Camilla, the symbolic rise of Catherine, the seriousness of William's future role, and the possible weight of Anne's institutional support. None of it proves a confirmed palace rupture. But together, it suggests a monarchy entering a more delicate stage, where every internal adjustment carries public meaning. Because the real question was no longer whether one royal figure had gained or lost duties. It was whether the balance of power around the crown had begun to shift before the nation was meant to notice. And once that possibility entered the conversation, the situation moved into far more dangerous territory, where the next development could change how every earlier sign was understood. And that next development, according to some royal commentators, was not a loud announcement but a quiet change in the rhythm of the royal household. The kind of change that does not immediately shock the public, yet makes experienced observers pause. A name appearing less often, another name appearing more often, a diary adjusted without explanation. A royal presence moved from the center of one moment to the edge of another. If reports are accurate, this was when the alleged consequences of the Regency Clause 4 discussion began to feel visible. Not through a dramatic palace confrontation, and not through any confirmed public statement from Buckingham Palace, but through the suggestion that Camilla's official role had entered a period of restriction while the wider institution recalibrated around stability. And that word, stability, is the key to understanding why this moment became so serious. Because when the monarchy changes a schedule, it is rarely just a schedule. A royal diary is a map of trust. It shows who represents the crown, who is sent into public view, and who is considered safe to carry the institution's message. If Camilla's duties were truly paused or reduced, even temporarily, the meaning would travel far beyond the walls of the palace. It would suggest that the issue had moved from private concern into institutional consequence. For William, the reported development would mark one of the most difficult tests of his future leadership. A prince can be admired for patience. An heir can be praised for restraint. But a future king is ultimately measured by whether he can act when delay becomes dangerous. If he believed that the crown's internal processes needed protection, then silence alone would not be enough. He would have to choose between the comfort of family peace and the harsher duty of royal responsibility. That choice, however, could never be clean. Any action involving Camilla would inevitably touch Charles. The king's loyalty to his wife is part of the emotional foundation of his reign, and any move that appeared to limit her role could be interpreted as a challenge not only to her influence, but to the king's personal judgment. That is why the reported situation carries such a painful edge. It suggests that protecting the monarchy may sometimes require decisions that wound the people closest to the throne. And this is where public perception begins to shift. To some viewers, William would appear decisive, perhaps even necessary, a man proving that he understands the seriousness of the crown before he inherits it. To others, the same act could look cold, almost severe, as if the future were pressing too hard against the present. That divide matters because the monarchy does not survive by law alone. It survives by interpretation. It survives by whether people believe its actions are guided by duty rather than ambition. Catherine's position becomes more consequential in that atmosphere. If she steps into more visible duties while Camilla steps back, even for practical reasons, the public will inevitably read symbolism into the movement. Catherine would not need to claim authority for authority to gather around her image. Her presence alone, steady and familiar, could become the reassurance people are searching for. And once that happens, the contrast between the current reign and the next becomes harder to ignore. Yet the palace must be careful not to make Catherine appear like a replacement before her time. That would place unfair pressure on her and risk turning admiration into expectation too quickly. The Princess of Wales can strengthen the monarchy precisely because her public style feels calm rather than forceful. If her rise in visibility appears too calculated, the very quality that makes her trusted could become vulnerable to scrutiny. This is why Princess Anne's role may become significant in the eyes of royal watchers, and represents the discipline of service, not the drama of personality. If the king's sister is seen as supporting a firmer internal line, it could give the reported decisions a different meaning. They would not look like the ambitions of a younger generation alone. They could be interpreted as the old guard recognizing that the institution must be protected from confusion, even when the cost is uncomfortable. But even that interpretation carries danger. A palace that appears too united around one course of action may invite questions about what forced such unity in the first place. A palace that appears divided may raise fears about the monarchy's long-term strength. This is the narrow corridor the royal household must walk, showing enough order to reassure the public, but not so much control that the public begins asking what crisis required it. According to observers, the strongest turning point may be this: the story is no longer about whether Camilla's role is popular or controversial. It is about whether the monarchy is quietly testing the limits of influence around the king. If royal duties, communication channels, and public representation are being adjusted with unusual caution, then the institution may already be responding to pressures that have not been fully explained outside palace walls. And that makes the consequences larger than one person. Charles must preserve dignity. William must show discipline. Catherine must carry reassurance without appearing elevated too quickly. Camilla must remain part of the king's reign without becoming the center of questions about control. And other senior figures must project unity without exposing the strain required to maintain it. Every role becomes more delicate. Every public appearance becomes more heavily loaded. So by this stage, the alleged Regency Clause 4 no longer functions only as a phrase. It becomes a symbol of the monarchy's deepest fear, that private influence could affect public stability, and that the future may need to step forward before the present is ready to make room for it. Whether the reports prove accurate or remain part of royal speculation, the conversation itself has already changed how people look at the balance around the crown. Because the real consequence was not only what may have happened inside palace walls, it was what the moment revealed about the future. And to understand what this truly means, we have to look at the one question still sitting at the center of everything. Is William protecting the monarchy from instability, or is the monarchy itself quietly beginning to reorganize around the reign that comes next? And that is where the story reaches its most important meaning. Because if William is protecting the monarchy from instability, and if the monarchy is also beginning to reorganize around the reign that comes next, then both interpretations may be true at the same time. In royal life, duty is rarely clean. It often arrives wrapped in family pain, public expectation, and decisions that only become understandable when history looks back on them. The reported Regency Clause 4 moment matters because it speaks to something larger than Camilla's duties or one alleged internal order. It reflects a monarchy under pressure to prove that it can still govern itself with discipline. The crown cannot ask the public for trust while appearing uncertain about its own internal balance. It must show that access, influence, and representation are being handled with care, especially when the health of the king, the visibility of the queen, and the future role of the Waleses are all being discussed at once. If the reports are accurate, William's position becomes one of painful responsibility. He would not simply be acting as a son or even as an heir. He would be acting as a guardian of the institution he is destined to inherit. That does not make the decision easy, and it does not remove the emotional cost. But it does show why the future king may be judged, not only by how he behaves in moments of celebration, but by how he responds when the monarchy's quiet machinery appears to be under strain. And yet, this is where the competing interpretation remains powerful. Was such a move, if it happened, truly about protecting the crown, or did it risk opening a deeper family wound? Charles is not just the monarch in this story. He is a husband, a father, and a man whose reign has already carried heavy personal history. Any action involving Camilla would inevitably touch his pride, his loyalty, and his sense of authority. For a royal family that has spent years trying to project unity, even a careful internal adjustment could carry emotional consequences that last far beyond the immediate moment. Camilla's place in the wider meaning of this story is also significant. Whether one views her with sympathy, skepticism, or historical caution, her role beside the king represents the present reign. If her visibility is questioned, reduced, or even rumored to be restricted, the public immediately begins asking what that says about the strength of the current royal order. A queen who steps back, for any reason, does not disappear from public imagination. Instead, her absence becomes a symbol, and symbols inside monarchy often speak louder than statements. Catherine's role becomes equally revealing. The Princess of Wales does not need to be named in every report for her presence to shape the discussion. If the future queen appears more central while Camilla appears less visible, the public naturally reads the moment as part of a generational shift. Catherine represents steadiness, family continuity, and the emotional image of the next reign. That does not mean she is replacing anyone before her time. But it does mean the monarchy's future image is becoming increasingly difficult to separate from her. This is why the long-term consequences could be profound. The monarchy may now be entering a phase where public trust moves before formal power. William remains heir. Charles remains king. Camilla remains queen. Catherine remains Princess of Wales. But emotionally, the public may already be rehearsing the next era, watching who appears prepared, who seems trusted, and who carries the calm authority people want to see in uncertain times. Royal observers will now be watching the details that usually pass unnoticed. They will watch the palace diary. They will watch who attends major national ceremonies. They will watch whether Catherine continues to appear in roles that feel larger than ordinary duty. They will watch whether and other senior royals seem to reinforce William's authority. And they will watch whether Camilla returns with full visibility or whether her public rhythm becomes more measured than before. That is the historical significance of this story. It reminds us that monarchy is not only shaped by crowns, ceremonies, and official announcements. It is shaped by access, timing, trust, and perception. Sometimes the most important power shifts are not declared. They are sensed. They appear through who is seen, who is absent, who is supported, and who quietly becomes the face of reassurance when the institution needs it most. So the final meaning is not that one unconfirmed claim should be treated as fact. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed the dramatic version of events. The final meaning is that the claim became believable to so many because it touched a real royal anxiety. The question of whether the present reign and the future reign are beginning to overlap in ways the palace cannot fully control. And perhaps that is the most delicate truth of all. If William is already being tested by decisions that feel kingly before he is king, then the next era is no longer distant. If Catherine is increasingly seen as the emotional anchor of that future, then the public has already begun assigning her a role larger than title alone. And if Camilla's place is now discussed through the lens of influence and limitation, then the monarchy's internal balance has become part of the public story. So what do you think? Was this simply one dramatic royal development, or does it point to a much larger shift inside the monarchy? Did William act as a responsible future king protecting the crown, or did this moment expose how fragile family loyalty can become when duty takes control? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep royal analysis, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary-style royal story. Because in the monarchy, power does not always move with a crown. Sometimes it moves first through silence, through trust, and through the person the public begins to see as the future before the future has officially arrived.